before electric heaters, before wool sweaters, before even the idea of a house. Humans survived winters that would kill most of us in a single night, not by chance, not by strength, but by inventing a way to think their way out of extinction. The wind howls like a hungry ghost, ice cracks beneath bare feet, and the world is silent. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of survival, when each breath drawn is defiance. Now close your eyes. You're not in a warm room. You're in a cave, low and dark. The fire flickers weakly, casting shadows on damp stone. The air tastes of smoke, wet fur, and ancient dust. Your children are asleep, curled into you for warmth. Outside, the wind does not forgive, and yet, you are not afraid. Because your kind, small, clever, unfinished, has found a way to win against the cold. Not with claws, not with speed, but with firelight, stitched furs, shared stories, and something even greater. A mind that could imagine warmth before it ever existed. This is not just a story of survival. It's the story of the first humans who refused to freeze and chose instead to create. How did they do it? Stay close to the fire. The story is just beginning. The sky was not blue. It was bone gray, thick with snow that never truly fell, but hovered in silence like ash after fire. Beneath it, the earth lay still, not dead, but waiting. Trees stood bare, like charred skeletons. Rivers had forgotten how to flow. And above the land, the wind carried no scent but cold, a cold so deep it could shatter skin, silence lungs, and bury sound itself. This was the Ice Age. Not a single winter, but thousands upon thousands of them. An era not of seasons, but of survival. And into this brutal theater stepped the first real humans. They were small, their bodies wrapped in animal hide, their feet calloused like stone. Their breath hung in the air, a fragile thing, as if life itself might crack apart if they dared exhale too hard. They had no steel, no concrete, no roof above their heads, no language that we would understand. And yet, they had everything they needed, because what they did have was each other, and the spark of a mind that refused to die. This is where our story begins, not with firelight or shelter or invention, but with pressure, the kind of pressure that crushes or creates. It was the winter that shaped us, not by killing the weak, but by awakening something buried in the human brain. A question: what if we don't just endure? What if we adapt and overcome? Because the cold did not come with mercy. It did not care for cleverness. It came to erase, and the only way through was transformation. Somewhere, 40,000 years ago, a child cried in a cave, not from hunger or pain, but because the air had gone so cold it burned her throat. Her mother pressed a fur against her lips. The father fed the fire, not just with wood, but with memory. Last year, we nearly froze. But not this year. This year, we build better walls. And that flicker of foresight, became humanity's first step toward survival. Outside, the wind howled like it knew what was coming. But inside, the humans had decided to answer back. Long before the word warmth was ever spoken, we chased it. In a world that tried to kill us every night, warmth wasn't comfort. It was salvation. Not just for the body, but for the soul. Because the cold in the Ice Age wasn't the kind that numbed your fingers and made you shiver. It was the kind that waited. The kind that sat outside your shelter like a predator with patience. A cold that could stop a heartbeat in the time it took to draw breath. And so, long before kings or countries, before gods or graves, we learned to light fire. But we didn't discover fire like a lucky spark falling from the sky. We stole it, from storms, from trees struck down in fury, and once we held it, we never let go. The first fire wasn't built, it was begged for, from embers carried miles in dry bark, kept alive with careful breath, guarded like a secret. It was a dance between man and flame, clumsy, desperate, sacred. You must understand, for early humans, fire was not a tool. It was a being. It moved, it fed, it died when neglected, and when it lived, it gave life in return. Inside caves, fire changed everything. No longer did the dark rule the night. No longer did predators own the shadows. The circle of firelight became the first boundary we ever drew, between life and death, warmth and cold, the known and the wild. Its crackle was the first lullaby, its heat the first medicine, its light the first storybook. We began to gather around it, not just to survive, but to become. Because around the fire, we were more than hunters and gatherers. We were thinkers, dreamers, problem solvers. We became human. But early fire was a fragile thing. To keep it alive, our ancestors became scientists without knowing the word. They learned which woods burned hottest, which gave smoke that choked the lungs, and which could be carried without going out. They noticed that dry pine crackled and spit, while birch burned clean. They understood that damp logs wasted fuel, and that slow-burning embers could last through the night if fed the right way. They experimented, failed, learned, taught. They discovered that stones placed around the fire held heat, glowing softly long after the flames had died, and that placing fire against a cave wall could create a convection current, warm air circulating, pushing back the frost that crept in with the dusk. They built fire pits in patterns, not randomly, but with intention. Hearths became central, not just physically, but socially. The fire was the heart of the home, and as their shelters improved, so did their understanding of what fire could do. They began to use it to cook, transforming meat into something safer, softer, more nourishing. They learned to boil water with hot rocks to smoke and dry meat for preservation. Fire was now technology, and it didn't stop there. With fire, they reshaped stone tools, heat-treating flint to make sharper blades. With fire, they softened bone and wood, reshaping the materials of survival. With fire, they created light, and with that light, they painted. Yes, the cave walls tell stories not just of animals and gods, but of fire's gift. For without fire, there is no paint in the dark, no brush to carve antlers into the stone, no myth shared between generations huddled around the glow. But fire didn't just change how we lived, it changed how we thought, because to build fire is to plan. You gather wood before you need it. You guard embers while traveling. You understand time in a way that looks forward, to nightfall, to hunger, to winter. Fire taught us the future. It trained our minds to imagine more than the moment, to build something not just for now, but for later. And once that mental door opened, it never closed again. From fire came foresight. From foresight came civilization. Yet fire was also danger, a gift too powerful not to respect. One wrong move, and your shelter turned to smoke. One spark in the wrong place, and warmth became ashes. And so, fire taught caution. It demanded discipline. We became its stewards, not its masters. We passed its secrets down carefully. A child might learn how to strike flint before they could speak in full sentences. A mother might teach which bark smolders and which bursts. A grandfather might tell of a fire lost in a storm and the cold night that followed. Fire became not just survival, it became story. The fire was never just fire. It was the first circle, the first lesson, the first symbol of everything sacred and shared. Even today, when we light a match. We're echoing the hands of someone who once squatted in a cave, breath-shaking, coaxing flame from dry grass with nothing but stone and desperation. They weren't cavemen. They were chemists, engineers, dreamers with frozen fingers, and fire was their first masterpiece. But as powerful as fire was, it had limits, because the cold did not wait outside politely. It slipped through cracks, it curled into bones, and sometimes even fire could not chase it out. To survive fully, something more was needed. Not just warmth, but walls. The fire burned at the center, but it was the walls around it that kept death out. Because fire alone was a flickering heartbeat, it warmed only what it touched. But the cold seeped through stone, wrapped itself around bone, and waited. To survive an Ice Age winter, humans needed more than warmth. They needed protection. A second skin, not worn, but built. And so, they became architects, not of castles or cities, not yet, but of survival itself. The first shelters were simple: a windbreak of branches, a dugout in the snow, a cave, if they were lucky, deep and dry with a high ceiling to trap smoke and low nooks to sleep in warmth. But soon, caves were not enough. They were few. They were shared with predators, and they did not follow the herds. So we began to build, from scratch, from nothing, from bones, bark, hides, and hope. Imagine a wind so fierce it carves the land itself. Imagine snow that doesn't fall, it attacks. Imagine nights so long the sun feels like myth. Now imagine building a home in that world. Our ancestors did. In the steppes of Ukraine, in the valleys of France, in the tundra of what would become Russia, they raised shelters from mammoth bones. Yes, mammoth bones, skulls for foundations, tusks for arches, long bones for walls and ribs, fur stretched tight as insulation, snow itself packed into gaps as a final seal. What they made wasn't crude, it was deliberate, it was engineered, a dome, circular, compact. Why? Because wind slides past round walls, because small spaces trap heat, because every inch mattered when the world was trying to freeze you from the inside out. They dug into the earth, using the permafrost itself as part of the structure, cold on the outside, but stable. They learned to face entrances away from the wind, to build double walls of hide and air, to create microclimates where children could sleep and not die. Inside, they placed the hearth at the center. Smoke vented through small holes in the ceiling or wall seams. Stones circled the fire, not for beauty, for thermal memory. They would stay warm through the night, slowly radiating heat after the flames died. The floor was layered, dry grass, then fur, then woven mats. The cold never touched bare skin. This wasn't instinct, it was invention. A cave was a gift, a shelter was a decision, and that decision saved lives, because with each generation, shelters became smarter, more durable, more portable, more precise. They invented frameworks, poles lashed together, skins layered like armor. They discovered how to stitch hides together so tightly that no snowflake could pass. They added vestibules, small entry spaces that trapped cold air before it entered the main space. Like the airlocks of a spaceship, thousands of years before the concept existed. And they taught these designs not with blueprints, but with hands. A child learned to scrape hides not to help, but to live. A teenager learned to shape mammoth ribs not as art, but as infrastructure. An elder told stories not to entertain, but to encode knowledge. This wall fell in the last storm, so this time we built it with double supports. This seam let water in, so this time we used sinew instead of grass cord. This shelter kept us alive, so this time we remember why. There was no school, no lecture, But there was mastery. Through trial and pain, failure and repair, shelter building was a culture, and with it, humanity stepped into a new age, no longer dependent on caves or chance. They could bring their own warmth. They could choose where to live, to follow food, to avoid floods, to gather in groups. Mobility became freedom. And freedom, in a frozen world, was the rarest form of power. And with this came something new: communal space. Before shelters, survival was solitary, but a warm dome could hold a family, or two, or more. And when people slept together, ate together, and lived shoulder to shoulder, something changed. They began to organize, to share, not just space, but responsibility. Who gathered firewood? Who maintained the hides? Who watched the entrance at night? Division of labor was born inside the walls of these shelters, and with it came hierarchy, cooperation, even ritual, because shelter was more than structure. It was memory. Each one carried the lessons of the last. Each one stood on the failures that came before. Each one was shaped by those who remembered. And perhaps that's what made shelter building so profound. Not just that it protected the body, but that it preserved knowledge, a living architecture passed down not in books, but in blood. Every beam, every hide, every seam, a signature of survival. Even now, in the far Arctic, the echoes remain. The Inuit igloo, the Sami lavu, the Nenet's chum. Different names, different shapes, same principle: warmth against the void. Their ancestors knew what ours once did, that a well-built shelter isn't just a house, it's a shield, a womb, a promise, that no matter how hard the cold screams, there will be a place it cannot reach. But of course, even the best walls need armor. And there comes a point when staying inside is not an option, when the hunt calls, when the storms demand food, when survival means stepping back out into the frozen unknown. And for that, we would need to invent warmth we could wear. The cold doesn't just live in the air. It creeps beneath the skin, burrows into bone, and waits, silently, to see who will fail first. And when fire could no longer reach you, when walls couldn't walk with you into the wild, you had to wear your survival. The invention of clothing is often treated as simple. Throw on a fur, keep walking. But that is a lie born from comfort. Because in a world where the wind could flay your skin like a knife, wrapping yourself in a dead animal wasn't enough. You needed layers. You needed engineering. You needed to become your own shelter. And so, our ancestors, with no factories, no needles, no instructions, created the first wearable technology. They did not invent fashion. They invented thermal systems. Imagine this. A man stands at the edge of a frozen plain. The wind cuts sideways. His breath vanishes midair. Around him, the world is white and howling. But he doesn't shiver. He wears 3 layers. Closest to his skin, the soft underfur of a reindeer, dense, dry, and warm. Over that, a thick pelt, stiffened with age and cured with brain and smoke. And over that, a shell, sewn tightly from hide, rubbed with animal fat until nearly waterproof. This man is not wearing clothes, he's wearing intelligence. The journey to this moment didn't happen overnight. It began with pain, the kind of pain that comes from frostbitten fingers, from cracked lips that bleed, from skin so cold it burns like fire. And pain teaches. Our ancestors learned that fur alone wouldn't protect them. The outer guard hairs of many animals, coarse and shiny, couldn't trap heat. But the undercoat, that downy layer beneath, that was gold. So they started selecting hides not just by size, but by science. Muskox, Arctic hare, reindeer, wolf. They learned which animals stayed warm not by fat alone, but by fur designed by evolution itself. But raw hides were stiff. They froze, tore, and cracked when dry. So humans began to cure them, using brain matter, urine, smoke, and ash. Each method different, each learned by trial and memory. Each a chemical process mastered long before chemistry had a name. They learned how to keep the hide flexible, even in sub-zero cold. They learned to seal seams with sinew, not grass, and to rub fat into fibers so that water slid off instead of sinking in. And then, they invented something miraculous. The needle, carved from bone, tapered to a point, polished smooth, with a tiny hole bored through one end, so precise it still humbles modern archaeologists. With this tool, humanity stepped into a new age. Before the needle, hides were wrapped and tied, bulky, heavy, loose. After the needle, hides were shaped. Clothing could be fitted, movement was easier, insulation improved. Now, air could be trapped, that invisible layer between skin and fur that holds heat like a secret. Needles allowed stitches, stitches allowed seams, seams allowed tailoring, and tailoring allowed survival. They stitched by firelight, using sinew pulled from animals, soaked, split, and twisted into thread. They stitched with purpose, strengthening points of wear, padding joints, reinforcing knees and elbows. They stitched for hours, days, years. A single cloak might take weeks to complete. A glove, even longer. But it wasn't just function. They stitched meaning into the garments. Across the Ice Age world, we find decoration. Thousands of tiny ivory beads sewn into coats, boots, and headdresses. Not for vanity, for symbolism, for memory, for identity. A woman in Siberia may have worn a cloak with bead patterns passed down from her mother. A language of lineage in loops and spirals. A child's coat may have been stitched with charms to protect them from spirits of the frost. A hunter's tunic may have carried the story of his clan, not told in words, but in patterns of stone and bone. These weren't just clothes, they were culture. And this too was innovation, because warmth alone is not survival. Humans are social creatures, born not just to endure, but to belong. And clothing became a marker of tribe, of role, of ritual. The one who wore the most decorated garment might lead the ceremonies. The hunter with fur dyed red with ochre might be chosen to speak to the ancestors. The girl who received her first stitched cloak wasn't just staying warm. She was stepping into adulthood. In the Ice Age, clothing didn't just carry heat, it carried meaning. But let us return to the cold, because ritual meant nothing if the wind reached your skin. So humans built systems of dress that mirror the very science used in modern Arctic expeditions today. Base layers, soft, moisture-wicking fur to keep skin dry. Mid layers, thicker hides and woven mats to trap air. Outer shells, waterproofed skins sealed against wind and snow. They added hoods, mittens, boots, and even face coverings, tailored pieces stitched with such precision that many of today's designs still echo their form. Boots were stuffed with dry grass or moss for insulation. Gloves were lined with fur and covered in hide. Foot bindings were invented to keep snow from creeping in. And cloaks were fastened with toggles of carved bone, strong, simple, elegant. They learned to adjust garments for movement, loosening layers for the hunt, tightening seams for rest. They designed modularity, thousands of years before the term was coined. This was not luck. This was the scientific method, performed with stone tools and frostbitten hands. Try, fail, adjust, repeat. Pass down what works, burn what doesn't. Teach every child not just how to wear, but how to make. And so, every stitch became survival. And yet, there was more. Because clothing did not just protect from weather, it became armor against fear. To leave the shelter was to walk into the unknown. Snowstorms, predators, cliffs, rivers, skies that never brightened for days. But when wrapped in carefully made garments, crafted by family, worn with memory, proven by time, one felt something else: confidence. The coat was a connection to ancestors, the boots a promise of return, the gloves a prayer stitched in sinew. And so, wrapped in these talismans, they ventured out, they hunted, they gathered, they journeyed, and every successful return proved one thing: we are not helpless, we are not prey. We are the kind of creature who can shape hide and hair into safety, who can turn the body of a beast into a barrier against extinction. And the knowledge spread across continents, across cultures, from the Gravettians of Eastern Europe, who buried their dead in bead-covered cloaks, to the peoples of Siberia, whose garments still influence Arctic survival gear today. They traded ideas. They copied brilliance. They improved endlessly, because the cold was relentless, and only those who adapted constantly would see another spring. Even now, the echoes remain. The jackets we wear, the boots we lace, the gloves we choose on bitter mornings. They are not new. They are reminders of a time when every layer was a battle plan, every stitch a gamble, every thread a lifeline. And in those threads, we survived. But winter does not end with movement, because even the best-made clothing could not warm the mind. And as the nights stretched endlessly, and the snow erased all direction, humans would face a new kind of enemy: loneliness. The fire was alive, but it needed to be fed, not just with wood, but with something more precious: calories, fuel for the body, energy to chase the hunt, to build the walls, to sit through nights that lasted longer than memory. Because in the Ice Age, hunger wasn't a feeling, it was a warning. It didn't whisper, it roared. And when it came not as emptiness, but as weakness, shaking hands, dimming vision, breath that frosted too quickly because the fire inside your body was starting to fade. The cold didn't just steal heat, it devoured strength. Every step in deep snow burned through reserves. Every hour spent exposed to wind leached the warmth from muscle and marrow. To survive, you didn't just need food, you needed strategy. Our ancestors didn't eat to live, they ate to endure, and endurance meant planning. There were no grocery stores, no pantries, no guarantees. There were seasons of plenty, yes, but those passed like breath in frost. What mattered was what could be saved, what could be preserved, what could be counted on when the world went still and white. So the Ice Age became a crucible of culinary innovation, a time of trial and error, of life measured in mouthfuls. And through it all, humans learned not just to hunt, but to manage, to transform a single kill into survival for an entire group, to look at a mammoth not just as meat, but as a season's worth of possibility. When they brought down a mammoth, and it took many to do so, the real work began. It wasn't celebration, it was urgency. The clock started ticking the moment the beast fell. The organs were still warm when knives were drawn. Muscle, fat, hide, bone. Every part had a purpose. Nothing could be wasted, and nothing was. They used stone scrapers to separate the hide quickly, preserving it for shelter or clothing. They carved deep into muscle, removing slabs of meat before the cold air could rot it. They split bones to reach the marrow, dense with fat, rich with energy. And they built fires not to cook immediately, but to smoke and dry. Smoke was the ancient refrigerator. It transformed meat from temporary into durable. They hung strips on racks above smoldering coals, letting the smoke wrap them in protection. Preserved meat could last weeks, even months. It was a lifeline. And when the kill was smaller, deer, bison, hare, they adapted. They learned to store meat in pits dug into frozen ground. Natural permafrost became their freezer. Sometimes they buried caches under stones or marked them with carved bones so others in the group could find them. And more than meat, they hunted fat. Yes, fat, more valuable than muscle in the deep cold. Because fat burned slower in the body, it provided long, sustaining heat. It fed the brain. It insulated organs. And it was hard to find. So when they discovered animals rich in it, seals, walrus, bears, they cherished every drop. They rendered it, boiled it, stored it in bladders, in shells, in bone containers. They smeared it on hides to waterproof them. They mixed it with berries to make pemmican, an ancient high-calorie bar that could last for years. And they fed it to the weak, the young, the old. Because when food was scarce, it wasn't just about eating. It was about choosing who would eat and why. This was survival, not of the fittest in strength, but the fittest in understanding. They observed the land. They followed the herds. They knew migration patterns not because they were taught in school, but because forgetting meant death. They watched the sky, the wind, the trees. They read the ground like a book. And in summer, when the land thawed, they didn't rest. They foraged. They gathered roots, berries, tubers, anything that could be eaten, dried, and stored. They used woven baskets, hide sacks, and dug storage holes lined with bark. They learned which plants could soothe the stomach and which would kill silently. They chewed tree bark to ease fever. They used moss as medicine. And they passed this knowledge down, not with textbooks, but with touch, with stories. A grandmother might show a child how to twist dried grass into cord, to hang herbs in the smoke. A father might guide his son's hand over a patch of snow, showing him where the tracks changed shape, signaling the animal had stopped to feed. This was education in its oldest form. Observation, repetition, purpose. Food was never just eaten. It was earned, understood, respected, and sometimes it was shared. That too was part of the mastery. They developed systems, rules, traditions. The hunter didn't eat alone. The meat was portioned by need. The elder who no longer hunted was fed from the same fire. The child, even if they had no role in the kill, received the best cut because the child was the future. And in this way, food became not just fuel, but connection. Around the fire, they didn't just warm their hands. They passed bowls, tore meat, shared silence, laughed through cracked lips. And in those small acts of generosity, something unspoken took root: community. Because in the Ice Age, food was trust. If you gave someone a piece of meat, you were saying, "I want you to live." And if they gave you a root they had hidden away since the last thaw, they were saying, "You matter to me." There were rituals too. The first bite saved for the spirit. The bone of the animal returned to the earth. Songs sung after a successful hunt, not to boast, but to thank. Gratitude etched into routine. And when famine came, and it did, often, it was not met with panic. It was met with preparation, because they had dry meat stored in wrapped bundles, because they had fat mixed with berries buried beneath marked stones, because they had learned over generations that abundance was fleeting, but wisdom could last. They dried fish on high racks by frozen rivers. They trapped small animals with woven snares. They cracked open frozen ponds to spear for eels beneath the ice. And sometimes they waited, fasted, gathered around the smallest fire, shared the thinnest broth, because waiting was survival too. Not every hunger could be fed. Not every winter was kind. But even in the hardest years they endured. And in doing so, they left behind more than bones and tools. They left behind the blueprint for how to feed the flame of life, even when the world tried to extinguish it. Modern humans eat without thought. Open a package, tap a screen. But when you feel the bite of true cold, when your fingers stop working and your stomach coils with emptiness, something ancient stirs. A memory not your own. The echo of a time when food was sacred, when every bite was earned with breath and blood. That echo lives in us still. A hunger not just for calories, but for purpose, for connection, for the knowledge that what we eat once came from hands that knew the value of enough. Our ancestors didn't just survive the cold. They fed the flame of body, of mind, of tribe. But the cold had other weapons. It could starve you, yes, but worse than hunger was silence, isolation, the crushing weight of months without sun, without newness, without escape. To face that, they would need more than food. They would need light that came from within. They would need meaning. The cold wasn't just outside. It crept into the mind. It began as silence, the kind that settles between breaths, between heartbeats. A silence too thick for song, too heavy for thought. Then came the stillness. Days that didn't change, skies that never brightened, snow that buried everything familiar. Time stopped making sense. There were no clocks, no calendars. Only the sound of fire crackling, the wind scratching at stone, the slow drip of melting ice inside a cave. And in that frozen stillness, the greatest battle was not against the elements. It was against yourself. Humans are not built for stasis. We are creatures of movement, of story, of pattern, of change. But winter in the Ice Age was not simply long. It was eternal. A night that stretched for weeks, a season that swallowed the year. And for those trapped inside shelters, with the same people, the same routines, the same meals day after day, the true threat wasn't frostbite. It was despair. And yet, they endured, not just with body, but with mind. Because the most powerful survival tool our ancestors ever developed wasn't a spear or a fur-lined cloak. It was meaning. They began to fight back against the emptiness not with firewood, but with ritual, with song, with symbols, with stories passed down, reshaped, repeated. Somewhere deep in a cave, a mother drew a handprint on stone, red with ochre, not to decorate, not to pass time, but to say, I am here, I exist, I matter. Somewhere else, a child hummed a pattern he had heard from his grandfather, a string of notes that no one else understood, but that made him feel like the sky was listening. These weren't distractions. They were lifelines. Because the cold didn't only numb fingers, it numbed purpose. And humans cannot survive long without purpose, so they made it. They painted the walls of their world. Bison, mammoths, handprints, spirals, constellations. Some of these images were sacred, some were stories. Some perhaps were simply expressions of feeling too deep for words. But all of them were acts of resistance. Each stroke said, the cold cannot take everything. It cannot take this. And what of the music? Flutes carved from bone, some over 40,000 years old, still sit in museums, perfectly tuned, capable of melody. Not by accident, not by fluke, but by design. Someone, in the midst of hunger and dark, took the time to carve holes, shape a mouthpiece, perfect the pitch. Why? Because rhythm anchors the soul. A beat can be followed, a note can be shared. And in a time when language was still young, perhaps music came first. A lullaby to calm a restless child, a chant to unify a group, a melody to mourn the dead. They sang to remember, they sang to stay human. But even art and music were not enough alone. There had to be structure. Ice Age communities began to create roles, not rigid, not hierarchies as we know them, but functions that gave identity. The firekeeper, the storyteller, the healer, the one who remembered the names of the ancestors. Everyone had a task, a reason to rise, because purpose was insulation. The elders told stories not just of the past, but of possibility, of the time when the mammoth returned, of the sun that would rise again, of the spring that had always come, even after the hardest years. And the children listened, wide-eyed in the flicker of the hearth, hearing not just tales, but hope. Isolation kills slowly, not through pain, but through erosion. You stop speaking, you stop laughing, you stop believing that the world will ever change. And so, they pushed back. They invented rituals, some simple, sharing food in a circle, rotating sleeping spots so no one stayed cold for too long. Some more profound, rites for the new season, songs for the dead, symbols carved into tools that were passed down like prayers, a spiral etched on a pendant, a dot pattern on a drum. These were more than decoration. They were reminders that the world had meaning, that their suffering was not random, that they were not alone. And in these small acts of belief, the cold was kept at bay, not outside, but inside. They even designed their shelters for mental survival. Some walls became storyboards, carved with scenes of hunts, of animals, of dreams. The hearth was not just central for heat, but for gathering. A place where the group sat together, eyes locked on the flames, voices rising and falling like the wind outside. They told tales of giants and spirits, of beings that lived in the stars, of ancestors who whispered through the smoke. Were these tales true? Maybe. Maybe not. But truth was not the point. What mattered was connection, to each other, to the past, to something greater than the endless cold. And still, the cold tested them. There were fights, there were breakdowns, there were moments when the silence grew too loud, when the shelter felt too small, when the darkness felt too permanent. And so they created systems of peace. They developed ways to settle disputes, soft words, shared meals, temporary separation. Not because they were saints, but because they had to be. In close quarters, conflict could not be allowed to grow, so they cut it off early, or turned it into ritual, a contest of strength, a shared chore, a song that demanded harmony. Everything served the same purpose, to keep the group whole. Because to be exiled into the snow was not punishment, it was death. Even their sleep patterns changed. In darkness that lasted for weeks, the body rebelled. Circadian rhythms broke down, so they adapted. They slept in shifts, created artificial day and night with firelight and routine. Morning was when the fire was fed. Night was when stories were told, and this structure gave the mind something to hold on to. An anchor. They even dreamed differently. Modern researchers believe that in long winters, REM sleep may have increased. Vivid dreams, symbolic visions, the birth of myth. Perhaps the first gods came to them not in sunlight, but in sleep, images born from minds desperate for meaning. And those dreams were told, remembered, carved into bone, etched into memory. Mental resilience wasn't luck. It was crafted by culture, by care, by choice. because our ancestors knew something we often forget, that the body cannot survive if the mind has given up. And so, they tended to the mind like they tended the fire, fed it, watched it, never let it go out. They didn't have therapists, they didn't have medicine for the soul, but they had each other, and they understood, without textbooks, without studies, that connection was everything. A hand on the shoulder, a shared joke in the dark, a song hummed by someone you loved. These were the things that kept the cold from winning. Because in the Ice Age, survival was never just about warmth or calories. It was about holding on to who you were, even when the world around you forgot. And maybe that's the lesson that echoes loudest today. That when the cold sets in, not just outside, but inside, we must do what they did. Paint, sing, share, sit close, create rituals, create roles, create meaning. Not because it's easy, but because it's what makes us human. But winter was not done testing them. For even with warmth and food and story, one question still lingered. How do you protect the next generation, not just from cold, but from forgetting? In the heart of every frozen shelter, nestled close to the fire, were the smallest lives, the children, born not into safety, but into struggle. Their first breath taken not in comfort, but in frost. And yet, against the harshest odds, they lived. More than that, they learned. Because to raise a child during the Ice Age was not simply to keep them warm or fed. It was to prepare them from the first cry to carry the flame of humanity forward. They were not protected from hardship. They were introduced to it gently through observation, imitation, and involvement. Even as infants, they were wrapped not just in furs, but in function. Swaddled close to their mother's body, secured beneath cloaks during hunts or travels, they absorbed rhythm before memory, heartbeat, footfall, the crackling of the fire. Their ears were filled with lullabies that had no words, just melodies shaped by thousands of winters. These songs weren't sung for luxury. They were anchors, ways to soothe the mind when the storm outside howled louder than thought. When they began to walk, their education began in full. There were no classrooms. There were no lessons. There was only life, and in that life, every action was an opportunity to learn. A child was not told how to scrape a hide. They watched hands that moved with quiet precision, watched blades that danced along muscle and fat, watched sinew stretched into thread, and eventually, they reached for tools. Clumsy at first, but always encouraged. Mistakes were not failures. They were rites of passage. Bloodied knuckles, bent needles, skewed seams. Each misstep was a lesson written into the body. Play was never separate from preparation. Children mimicked adults not in games of fantasy, but in rehearsals of survival. A toddler might hunt with a stick, tracing the movements of their father. A girl might stitch beside her grandmother, threading imaginary sinew through holes poked into bark. These actions were more than cute. They were training. Every motion embedded memory. Every repetition wove muscle and mind together. By the time a child reached 7 or 8, they were contributors, not dependents. They could fetch firewood, track footprints, identify useful plants. They could mimic calls to lure animals. They could spot weakness in a wall or a tear in a hide. In a world where every pair of hands mattered, age was not a barrier to responsibility. The community knew that investment in the young was investment in the group's future. They were the memory keepers in training. But teaching wasn't only physical, it was emotional. It was spiritual. Children were told stories, not just for entertainment, but for endurance. tales of ancestors who braved greater storms, legends of animal spirits that watched over them, myths that explained why the stars moved, why the wind changed, why the mammoth always returned in spring. These stories were not abstract. They were maps of how to think, how to feel, how to survive the unseen. And when grief came, as it often did, it was not hidden from the young. They saw death. They buried siblings. They said goodbye to mothers. But they did not carry this pain alone. The rituals of mourning included everyone. A child learned how to grieve by watching others do it with dignity, with ceremony. They learned that loss was part of life, not the end of it. And that memory, preserved in song, in carvings, in names, was a form of keeping the dead close. Clothing for children was made with just as much care as for adults. Smaller hides, softer linings, sometimes stitched with charms, tiny bones or beads meant to ward off illness, injury, or the ever-present danger of the cold. A child's coat might carry the symbol of their clan or the pattern of their mother's hands. Each item was more than functional. It was protective in every way, and they were protected, not by isolation, but by immersion. Children slept beside adults, listened to council decisions, sat close during planning. They weren't shielded from the realities of winter. They were guided through them. When a hunt went badly, they learned to ration. When food was scarce, they watched elders sacrifice their portions for others. And when joy came, when a new child was born, when a feast was held, when the sun returned, they learned celebration, learned that even in hardship, life could be sacred. Discipline was rarely harsh. It didn't need to be. A child who put the fire at risk or wasted food quickly understood the consequences, not through punishment, but through communal disappointment. Survival was a shared responsibility, and every mistake impacted everyone. Correction came through stories, through reminders, through quiet expectation. And through this, children grew not in fear, but in respect for the environment, for their people, for themselves. One of the most beautiful truths of Ice Age parenting was this: every adult was a teacher. Biological ties mattered, but they did not define who cared for whom. The woman who had no children might be the best at telling stories. The elder too frail to walk might be the memory keeper. The young hunter might take a boy on his first tracking lesson. The burden of raising children was not placed on a few. It was distributed, celebrated, shared. And so, the children grew not just physically strong, but psychologically resilient. They learned how to wait, how to lose, how to hope. They learned that hunger could be endured, that fear could be spoken, that laughter could be medicine. They learned that silence did not always mean danger, and that the long dark was a place where dreams could be born, not just fears. When a child reached adolescence, they were marked, not always with ceremony, but with responsibility. Given their first real weapon, trusted to gather alone, invited to contribute ideas to group decisions. This shift was subtle, but profound. It told them, you are no longer the future. You are now the present. Your hands shape this world with the rest of us. Some groups may have had formal rites, a first hunt, a solo journey, a symbolic offering. But even without ritual, the transition was clear. The child became part of the web, not as someone to protect, but as someone who protected. It's easy, in our modern comfort, to romanticize these children, to imagine them as little warriors hardened by frost. But the truth is far deeper. They were still children. They played. They laughed. They found joy in watching snow melt from the roof of the shelter. They carved toys from bone. They chased shadows cast by firelight. Their eyes sparkled when a story turned magical. They clung to mothers when the wind howled too loud. What made them different was not their toughness. It was their connection to the earth, to the people, to the stories, to the fire. And what they carried forward was not just skill, but spirit. When we study the lives of Ice Age children, we don't just learn how they survived. We remember how we began. Because in every one of us today, beneath the clothes, the comfort, the screens, there is still a child of the cold, one who knows how to listen, how to learn, how to endure, and how to wonder. No one survived alone. That was the first rule, the most important, the one written not in words, but in actions passed down through firelight and footsteps. Because the Ice Age was not just a battle against temperature, it was a war against isolation. And the only thing stronger than the cold was the warmth between people. Human beings, even in their earliest forms, were wired for connection, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. A single person could not hunt a mammoth, could not build a shelter strong enough to hold back the wind, could not keep the fire going through the night while also sleeping. Survival was not a solo act. It was an orchestra. Every movement mattered. Every role was vital. And through this, the first blueprints of society emerged. There were no written laws, no official leaders, no rigid systems. But there was order, soft, flexible, and deeply intuitive. The group moved as one, but within that unity, there was balance. The strongest didn't rule with power. They served with skill. A man who hunted best led during the hunt. A woman who cured hides taught others how to prepare clothing. An elder who remembered the last great famine advised when stores ran low. Leadership shifted with the task. Respect was earned, not inherited. Within the shelter, every resource was shared. Food was portioned based on need, not possession. A nursing mother, a growing child, an injured hunter. Each received more, not because they demanded it, but because the group understood that their survival strengthened everyone. Selfishness wasn't punished. It was simply not allowed to thrive. In the Ice Age, greed was weakness, because hoarding heat, food, or effort made the whole group colder, hungrier, and more vulnerable. And so cooperation became instinct. Tasks were divided, not by rigid gender roles, but by skill, availability, and rhythm. Yes, men often hunted large game, but women were hunters too, of smaller animals, of roots, of knowledge. They were healers, gatherers, engineers. They made clothing, prepared food, raised children. And in many groups, their voices carried equal weight in decision-making. Children learned early that everyone worked, and no one's work was above another's. A good hide could mean the difference between comfort and frostbite. A well-cooked meal could keep the group strong enough to survive the next hunt. And then, there were the unspoken contracts, the agreements that held everything together. If a fire went out, someone else would relight it. If a wall tore open, someone would mend it. If a child cried in the night, the nearest hands reached out, even if they weren't the mother's. The bond between people wasn't based on blood alone. It was based on being there. Day after day, storm after storm. Conflict, of course, still existed. No community was perfect. Disagreements sparked over food, over space, over decisions. But in a world where exile was death, these conflicts could not be allowed to burn, so they were managed, softened, redirected, through mediation, through ritual, through quiet moments by the fire where a story reminded them what they were fighting for. Some researchers believe early humans used symbolic gestures to resolve tension, sharing a piece of food, touching foreheads, singing in unison. These actions weren't accidents. They were survival strategies for the soul. Trust was currency. A person who lied, who failed to contribute, who caused harm, they risked more than reputation. They risked the survival of everyone. But rather than immediate rejection, the group often tried to repair. Redemption was possible, because one more strong back in the snow could still mean the difference between life and death. And if trust could be rebuilt, it was worth the effort. In the evenings, after the work was done, the group came together, not just for warmth, but for something deeper. The fire was the heart, and around it stories were told, plans were made, songs were sung, laughter cracked open the cold. These gatherings were not luxuries, they were the glue, the ritual of presence. Everyone was seen, everyone was heard. Through these shared moments, identity formed, not just of the self, but of the group. Clans, tribes, families, whatever names they carried, they held meaning. Symbols were etched into tools, painted onto walls, sewn into clothing. They told others, this is who we are, this is where we belong. And when groups met others during migrations, at shared hunting grounds, along trade routes, they exchanged more than goods. They exchanged knowledge, techniques for preserving meat, methods of building better shelters, songs that became shared across vast distances. This willingness to share, to collaborate even with strangers, was not weakness. It was evolution, because innovation multiplies when ideas travel. And so humans began to form networks, threads of connection that stretched farther than anyone could walk in a single day. Over time, these threads became strong enough to withstand not just winters, but centuries. Within the shelter, the old were not cast aside. They were treasured, because they held memory. They knew what happened when the river rose, when the herds moved early, when the snow turned soft too soon. Their stories weren't just entertainment, they were data. Wrapped in metaphor, yes, but rooted in experience. And so they were listened to, honored, consulted. The young, in turn, were nurtured not just with food, but with expectation. Their role was clear, to carry everything forward: knowledge, culture, compassion. They were told not just how to survive, but why survival mattered. Not just how to build a shelter, but how to protect those inside it. And when they failed, and they did, the group didn't punish blindly. They taught, corrected, gave second chances. The sick were cared for, not out of pity, but out of principle. The person with a broken leg might not walk for weeks, but if they healed, they would return stronger. And more importantly, everyone knew it could be them next. So caretaking became part of the social fabric, a way to say, you matter, even when you cannot contribute. All of this, every rule, every rhythm, formed a blueprint, not written in ink or carved in stone, but lived, passed down. It was a social code that made humanity not just a species that survived the Ice Age, but a species that became capable of civilization. Because these early humans weren't just reacting to the world, they were reshaping it through behavior, through bonds, through belief in one another. They weren't perfect, but they were committed to something bigger than self, to the group, to the flame that only stayed alive if everyone protected it. Even today, echoes of that blueprint live in us, in how we gather, in how we share, in how we instinctively reach for others in times of crisis. The cold may be gone, the shelters may be built from steel and glass, but the wisdom of connection, the knowledge that no one survives alone, remains. The cold did not dull the mind, it sharpened it. In the frozen silence of the Ice Age, without cities, without books, without machines, the human brain was tested not in theory, but in practice. Intelligence wasn't measured in numbers, it was measured in survival. And every act of survival was a problem to solve, a question to answer, a puzzle of life and death. We often imagine early humans as primitive, reacting to nature with brute instinct, but that image is false. The people of the Ice Age were thinkers, deep, complex, and astonishingly adaptive. Every decision, from how to track prey to how to line a shelter with insulation, was a product of reasoning. Trial and error, yes, but also of observation, of memory, of learning passed down across generations. They didn't have a written language, but they remembered everything. Not just where the herd moved last winter, but when the ice cracked early, when a certain root bloomed too soon and made the old man sick, when the stars shifted in a certain way and the wolves followed a new path. They stored that knowledge in story, in song, in symbol. A tale about a fox outsmarting the moon might also be a coded message about seasonal migration. A chant sung before the hunt might carry instructions on how to flank a bison. Their minds didn't just retain information, they translated it into meaning. Toolmaking was one of their greatest tests and triumphs. A blade was not just chipped from stone by accident, it took precision, planning, purpose. Flints were selected by texture, shape, weight. Edges were shaped with patience, tapping with bone or antler to shave down the angles. One wrong hit could ruin hours of work, and once a blade was made, it was more than a weapon. It was a tool of memory, carved, marked, sometimes decorated. A spearhead might be as symbolic as it was sharp. And when they invented the compound tools, hafting a stone tip to a wooden shaft, securing it with resin and sinew, it was nothing short of brilliance. They created adhesives from tree sap. They used fire to shape and harden wood. They understood leverage, force, balance. They engineered not with blueprints, but with experience and the consequences of failure. But it wasn't only physical intelligence. It was spatial, social, emotional. To survive in tight shelters for months with others required empathy. To lead a group across an unfamiliar landscape required navigation skills and group cohesion. To teach a child how to sew, how to track, how to think for themselves, it demanded more than instinct. It demanded teaching, and that is intelligence in its purest form. Their brains were the same size as ours, sometimes even larger, and they used them fully, not to invent machines, but to become them. The human body became a calculator of wind speed, of snow density, of animal behavior. A hunter could read a patch of snow like a book, determining how long ago it was stepped on, what direction the prey had taken, how fast it had moved. That's data analysis, performed by intuition. Fire was another realm of genius. They didn't just use it, they made it. From flint and pyrite, from bow drills and ember bundles. They understood fuel types, dry grass for sparks, resinous wood for heat, green wood for smoke. They built fireplaces that vented smoke, trapped heat, even allowed cooking without losing precious warmth. A single misstep in fire management could mean suffocation or a burned shelter, but they got it right, again and again, and they were creative. Creativity wasn't decoration, it was strategy. A new way to tie a hide, a faster way to dry meat, a more efficient method to preserve fat. Innovation wasn't a bonus, it was survival. This intelligence was also visible in how they adapted to new environments. As glaciers advanced and retreated, humans moved across ice bridges, through mountains, along coasts, and wherever they went, They adjusted. New animals, new plants, new climates. In each case, they didn't just survive, they thrived. They mapped the world in their minds, understanding terrain, weather, ecosystems. No compasses, no maps, just memory, instinct, and logic. Their understanding of time was astonishing. They followed the lunar cycles, marking seasons by moon and star. They watched animal migration patterns and connected them to celestial movement. They weren't just existing, they were tracking, building internal calendars and routines. We see this in the cave art, not just drawings, but sequences, scenes that may represent time passing, moon cycles, herd movements. We see it in the artifacts, bone carvings with notches, possibly recording days, hunts, rituals. We see it in burial sites, carefully prepared with symbolism and offerings. These were not impulsive people. They were thoughtful, reflective, aware. They understood cause and effect, that this plant could heal while that one could kill, that a certain shape of shelter held heat better, that hunting too many animals from a herd meant starvation next season. This is ecological thinking, long-term strategy. They balanced immediate needs with future sustainability, and when faced with the unknown, they didn't retreat. They explored. They crossed continents, into Asia, into Europe, into the Americas, not blindly, but with calculated risk. Curiosity is intelligence, and theirs was boundless. Even their social systems showed cognitive depth, forming alliances with other groups, trading goods, shells, pigments, tools. These weren't random exchanges. They were part of a network of reciprocity, a primitive economy. And behind every trade was trust. That requires memory. That requires social intelligence. Their rituals also showed abstract thought, belief in spirits, in ancestors, in invisible forces that influenced life and death. Whether literal or symbolic, these beliefs provided meaning. They guided behavior. They bound people together. Religion, at its most basic, requires the ability to think beyond the visible, to ask why. All of this points to a truth we often overlook. The mind was their greatest weapon. It wasn't their strength or their speed or their claws that kept them alive. It was their capacity to think, to plan, to imagine. We don't descend from brutes. We descend from thinkers, from those who could look at a mammoth and see not just danger, but potential, from those who could watch the stars and know when the rains would come, from those who could carve a story into stone so that someone 1,000 winters later would understand they were not alone. The Ice Age was not just a test of endurance, it was an examination of thought. And humanity passed not by scraping through, but by building something extraordinary with nothing but mind and will. And perhaps the greatest sign of their intelligence is this: they did not merely survive the Ice Age, they shaped it. It didn't happen in a single night. There was no grand thaw, no sudden bloom of flowers. The Ice Age began to loosen its grip slowly, season by season, year by year. The great sheets of ice retreated. Rivers ran deeper, the air softened, and the world, once silenced by frost, began to whisper of change. For generations, humans had lived with one unyielding truth: cold shaped everything. What they ate, where they slept, how they lived. But now, that foundation was shifting, and as the climate transformed, so did they, not in panic, in preparation. They watched the land as they always had. They noticed the herds changing direction. Plants that once bloomed only briefly now lingered. New trees began to rise. With this change came opportunity and risk. The skills that once ensured survival had to evolve. The massive prey they had depended on began to disappear. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, once abundant, now rare. Some vanished entirely. It wasn't just loss, it was a redefinition of survival. Humans didn't cling to the past. They adapted. Again. They learned to track smaller game, to fish more, to trap. They explored new territories as ice-cleared paths that had been closed for centuries. Migration patterns shifted. The pace of change quickened. And slowly, the Ice Age came to an end. But it did not leave them empty. It left them equipped with knowledge carved into bone, with tools sharpened by generations, with stories full of warnings and wisdom, with a social structure that had been tested by the coldest years and proven resilient. They didn't just carry scars from the Ice Age, they carried a legacy. Fire, once a matter of life and death, became a tool of comfort. Clothing, once a shield, became a canvas for culture. Shelter became more than walls. It became community, identity. And the children of the cold? They became builders of the world we now call home. Their legacy lies in more than artifacts. It lives in our instincts, to gather, to prepare, to adapt. It lives in how we tell stories to make sense of fear. It lives in how we reach for one another when the dark closes in. Because even though the ice is gone, the lessons remain. Lessons of resilience, cooperation, and intelligence. Of how we became human, not despite the cold, but because of it. The Ice Age did not just test us, it defined us. Winter was not just a season, it was the world's most relentless teacher. In those long months of snow and darkness, knowledge did not rest. It grew. It had to. Because what winter took, in light and warmth, it gave back in clarity and necessity. Children watched their elders, but more than that, they watched the way their elders thought. Every tuft of fur that tore while making a jacket was a lesson. Every failing shelter, another instruction. Every meal stretched thinner when stores ran low taught patience, adaptability, and innovation. Winter was an immersive education, not for school books, but for bodies, brains, and bonds. Lessons came in every form, sometimes physical. How to arrange stones around the hearth to trap heat overnight. How to tessellate layers of furs and grasses to create insulation that worked as microclimate. How to predict when a river would freeze solid enough to travel, but still yield water in hidden springs. Survival was geometry, chemistry, and geology wrapped into stories by the firelight. But winter also taught mental endurance. When weeks of darkness blurred the days together, how did they keep hope alive? Through ritual, through rhythm, through repetition. Every sunrise painted with stories, every meal blessed with song, every lean period met with rites of renewal. That was schooling. It taught the mind how to bend under weight without breaking, how to find joy even when the world pressed cold against the soul. Winter taught system thinking. The hunt wasn't just about following a beast. It was about reading signs, broken branches, smudged footprints, frozen breath marks. The group learned to strategize. Who would track? Who would flank? Who would flank the flank? They observed patterns in the stars to predict storms. They learned that wind from the east brought cold that could kill in an hour. East wind became more than weather. It was a warning. It was a lesson in timing, in planning, in collective cognition. They learned empathy in winter. When a hunter came back with nothing but fatigue in their bones, the group didn't scorn. They offered their share. When the fire sputtered, someone who could stay awake all night did. When frostbitten fingers bled, they were tended. You survived winter not by yourself, but by a tapestry of small, deliberate acts. And those acts were taught to the young, not in lectures, but in living them. Winter was also a school of memory. Oral traditions deepened, myths enriched. The line between story and instruction blurred. A tale of a beast that walked on ice taught how thin it could get. A song about sun's return became a calendar. Even tools sang lessons, bones carved with notches to track days, fur gloves stitched with patterns that spelled family lineage. Winter was not a time to rest. It was a time to learn hard, fast, and deep. By spring, when the thaw came, first trickles, then flooding rivers, then grass, humans emerged transformed. They were not weaker for having endured. They were sharper, wiser, more connected. Winter had known them, had shaped them, had educated them on how to think, how to feel, how to sustain. So when the ice finally retreated, they weren't just stepping into life. They were stepping into a classroom without walls, but with depth deeper than any school. They carried the lessons of winter forward, into shelter, into art, into strategy, into civilization. Wind-blown snow stretches endless in every direction, but even in the most frozen reaches, human voices carried farther than the cold. It wasn't just goods that were traded. It was ideas, innovations, survival itself. Among Ice Age communities, trade was the greatest kind of intelligence sharing. Small bands met at hunting grounds or frozen river crossings. One group brought a handful of ochre, another carried bone needles, another animal fat. Exchange was quiet, respectful, a trade of need and knowledge. They didn't need markets or notes. A gift of usable hide from one person meant a returning divide of smoked meat. Knowledge passed between groups. This hide treated with fat lasts through the thaw. This stitch pattern doesn't tear in wind. This fire pit shape holds heat twice as long. Each nugget of wisdom exchanged could mean the difference between warmth and death. Trails soon formed between camps, routes more vital than any river or ridge. These routes were marked by totem stones or carved posts. Travelers left messages. Herd moved east. High winds tomorrow. Ideas themselves had value, and the costliest commodity was anonymity. Cooperation became reputation. A group known for helpfulness gained trade partners, protection, goodwill. When winter raged, strangers trading snow-dried meat could save lives. These were early networks, human connection stretching across death's edge before words like society or economy existed. The trade was not only material. Stories traveled too. Hunting techniques, tool improvements, healing plants, psychological rituals for the long dark. One tribe's myth about a spirit guiding hunters became another's song. A pottery pattern passed from cave wall to another cave farther away. Communities learned not only to survive individually, but collectively, across geography and generations. This exchange became our precursor to civilization, not by conquest, but by cooperation. In the silence of ice, they built a map of human understanding. The cold could isolate, but it also compelled unity, and in unity, wisdom spread. So when at last the ice retreated, humanity was not fragmented. It was networked, connected, enriched by every shared idea. Paths across ice became routes of culture, routes of progress. And that is how ideas skated across the world faster than war ever would. We sit in rooms with glass that never cracks and heat controlled at will. And yet, inside, we sometimes feel the same emptiness that haunted frozen shelters. Civilization has brought comfort, but along with it, disconnection. While our hearts still beat with ancient rhythms, our awareness often doesn't. We've forgotten lessons that kept knowledge flowing across generations. In the Ice Age, innovation was urgent. Tools, shelter, clothing, medicine, stories. They shared freely because survival required it. Now, ideas are defended with patents, cloaked behind commerce, hoarded in vaults or courtrooms. Human solidarity dimmed. Climate cycles used to be natural, now may be manipulated or ignored. The Ice Age humans knew how to align their lives with seasons, stored food, migrated with herds, built rhythms around nature's pulse. We manipulate energy, cleave forests, ignore the consequences. When hardship hits, storms, pandemics, collapse, the instinct is to isolate, not to reach out. We react like individuals, not communities. We argue loudly over small comforts, when the ancestors argued over tools and warming their children through the night. We've lost the context that made cooperation itself a message written by necessity. But the wisdom remains buried, like embers beneath ash. We can reclaim it. We can rebuild small circles of trust, sharing meals, grilling ideas, helping each other across small winters of isolation or fear. We can remember what generosity looked like when only the strong survived, and understand it's still the strongest choice. Our ancestors didn't just survive cold seasons. They created the social heartbeat that kept minds alive. Let's rediscover that rhythm before the modern winter arrives. In the dark that comes not from cold, but from disconnection, we must remember the fire still burns. It burns not in wood or bone, but in human hearts. The spark our Ice Age ancestors sparked hundreds of centuries ago lives on in us now. Whenever we reach into community, whenever we share an idea, a meal, a story, whenever we teach a child to watch tracks, to listen to wind, to create something from nothing, that spark is still alive. The technical minds that built shelters with convection, layered clothing, smoked meats, these were our first engineers. The storytellers, the singers, the keepers of ritual, these were our first artists. In them, we can see ourselves, waiting, warming, surviving, connecting. Today, heat comes from machines, but warmth, true warmth, comes from connection, kindness, and purpose. The cold we face today may not be frost or snow, but it still wants to erase us. Bitterness, loneliness, apathy. The fire they fought for was external. Ours must be internal. It is compassion, creativity, community. That is the flame that keeps humanity alive. And tomorrow, when the world feels frigid, not in temperature, but in spirit, let us tend this fire. Not with logs, but with our voices, our hands, our hearts. Because as long as we do, the light our ancestors lit will guide us too.